The cruelest moment in a woman's life, the old pastor would later say, is not when a man leaves her, but when he does it in front of the entire world. The bells of St. Matthew's Church had been ringing for nearly 10 minutes when the whispers began. Guests shifted uneasily in the polished wooden pews, the soft rustle of silk dresses and tailored suits filling the vast sanctuary. At the altar stood Emily Carter, her gloved hands folded carefully over a small bouquet of white lilies, her posture perfectly still despite the growing tension that pressed against the room like heavy air before a storm. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, scattering warm colors across the marble floor, yet none of it seemed to reach the chill slowly settling in Emily's chest. Everyone was waiting for the same thing, the arrival of William Hawthorne, the groom. The man who had promised forever with a diamond ring and a confident smile just 6 months earlier. Emily kept her gaze forward, her chin lifted with quiet dignity, even as the murmurs behind her grew louder. 5 minutes passed, then 7. The wedding coordinator checked her watch again, her expression tightening. Finally, the large oak doors at the back of the church creaked open. A collective breath swept through the crowd. But it was not William who stepped inside. Instead, a young courier in a gray coat hurried down the aisle, his nervous eyes scanning the room until he reached the altar. In his trembling hand was a sealed envelope. Emily felt the shift before the man even spoke. She took the letter slowly, her fingers steady though the entire church seemed to lean forward in anticipation. The wax seal carried the unmistakable crest of the Hawthorne family. Her heart gave one quiet, hollow beat as she broke it open. The words were short, cold, efficient. William Hawthorne would not be attending the ceremony. He had reconsidered the arrangement and would instead be marrying Margaret Whitmore, the wealthy heiress whose family fortune had recently become the talk of half the East Coast. For a moment, the world went silent. Not the gentle silence of a church. The kind that falls when hundreds of people realize they are witnessing a humiliation they will discuss for years. Somewhere in the crowd, someone gasped. Another voice whispered, barely disguised, "He left her." Emily lowered the letter. Slowly, her face revealed nothing. Not anger, not tears. Only the calm composure of a woman refusing to collapse under the weight of public disgrace. But at the far back of the church, one man watched the scene unfold with a different expression entirely. Alexander Hawthorne stood motionless in the shadow near the doorway, his tall frame rigid, his dark eyes fixed on the woman standing alone at the altar. William's older brother had arrived only minutes earlier, unaware that he had stepped into the aftermath of betrayal. As the whispers swelled through the church like rising wind, Alexander did not look at the crowd. He did not look at the pastor or the stunned guests. He looked only at Emily Carter, the woman his brother had just abandoned, and something unfamiliar stirred behind his steady gaze, something that felt dangerously close to respect. The silence inside St. Matthew's Church lingered long after the guests began to leave, like a shadow refusing to lift from the polished marble floor. One by one the pews emptied, the quiet conversations drifting toward the tall wooden doors as people carried the story of the ruined wedding out into the bright afternoon. Emily Carter remained near the altar for several moments after the crowd had thinned, the folded letter still resting lightly in her hands. Anyone watching might have expected tears or anger, but neither came. Instead, she took a slow breath, lifted her chin, and walked down the aisle with the same calm dignity she had shown while standing there alone. The lilies in her bouquet brushed softly against the fabric of her dress with each measured step. Outside, the church steps overlooked a quiet street lined with old maple trees whose leaves rustled gently in the early autumn breeze. Emily paused at the top of the steps, as if allowing the sunlight to steady her. A few distant onlookers still lingered near their cars, whispering behind careful smiles. The story had already begun to spread. She had been abandoned. In the world of polite society, such moments were remembered far longer than kindness ever was. Emily descended the steps slowly, each footfall deliberate, refusing to hurry away like someone escaping shame. A black sedan waited near the curb to take her home, but before she could reach it, a deep voice spoke behind her. "Miss Carter." She turned slightly, surprised not by the voice itself, but by the quiet authority within it. Standing a few feet away was Alexander Hawthorne. In the sunlight, his presence seemed even more striking than it had inside the church. Tall, composed, his dark suit perfectly tailored, he carried himself with the effortless confidence of someone accustomed to being observed. Yet his expression held none of the curiosity or thinly veiled amusement she had seen on other faces that afternoon. Instead, there was something steadier, something thoughtful. Emily studied him for a brief moment. Of course, she recognized the name. In New York social circles, the Hawthorne brothers were often mentioned together, though rarely in the same tone. William was known for charm and ambition, for bold decisions and louder laughter. Alexander, on the other hand, was spoken of with a different kind of respect. The older brother, the one who ran the Hawthorne family business with quiet precision, the one who rarely appeared in gossip columns because he did not need attention to command a room. "I suppose you came to witness the spectacle as well," Emily said gently, her voice even, the faintest trace of irony softening her words. Alexander shook his head slowly. "I arrived only minutes before the letter was delivered." His gaze rested on her with careful seriousness. What happened today should never have happened at all. Emily looked out toward the street again, watching a passing car glide through the sunlight. Life continued with remarkable indifference to personal tragedies. "That seems to be the way of the world," she replied calmly. "Some promises are simply not worth very much." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The breeze lifted a loose strand of Emily's hair, carrying with it the faint scent of autumn leaves. Alexander noticed something then that surprised him. She was not trembling. She was not hiding behind anger or humiliation. She stood there with quiet strength, as though the storm had passed, and she had already chosen not to be broken by it. In that instant, Alexander Hawthorne understood something his younger brother clearly had not. William had not merely abandoned a bride that morning. He had walked away from a woman far stronger than he had ever taken the time to see. The Carter house stood on a quiet street in Brooklyn where the brownstone buildings carried the quiet dignity of families who had once known better days. Late afternoon sunlight stretched across the narrow sidewalks as Emily Carter stepped out of the car and paused for a moment before climbing the short set of stone steps leading to her front door. The white ribbons still tied to the handles of the vehicle behind her fluttered softly in the breeze, a reminder of the celebration that had been meant to take place only hours earlier. Inside the house, the air felt calm but heavy, as though the walls themselves had already heard the news. Her mother sat near the window in the small sitting room, hands folded tightly in her lap, while her younger brother Daniel pretended to read the newspaper without turning a single page. When Emily entered, both of them looked up at the same time. No one asked the question out loud. They did not need to. Emily placed the bouquet of lilies gently on the table and removed her gloves with careful movements. "He chose someone else," she said simply. Her voice carried no bitterness, only quiet certainty. "Margaret Whitmore." Her mother closed her eyes briefly. The Whitmore fortune had been mentioned in newspapers for months. Shipping investments, railroads, oil partnerships across the Midwest. A marriage into that family could change a man's future overnight. Daniel lowered the newspaper slowly. So that was the reason. Emily nodded once. Business disguised as romance. Outside the window, a delivery truck rumbled past, the city continuing its daily rhythm without pause. Yet inside the Carter home, the consequences of the broken wedding already loomed large. The Carter family had spent the last 3 years quietly rebuilding after a series of failed investments left by Emily's late father. The planned marriage had not been merely a romantic promise. It had been stability, respectability, protection from the kind of whispers that could quietly close doors in polite society. Now those whispers would only grow louder. Emily crossed the room and poured herself a glass of water, her movements unhurried. "I suppose the invitations will become collector's items now," Daniel muttered with forced humor. Emily allowed herself a small smile. "Perhaps they will. At least the printing was elegant." Her calmness unsettled her mother more than tears would have. "Emily, you do not have to pretend strength for us," her mother said softly. Emily turned toward her and rested one hand lightly on the back of a chair. "I am not pretending." The words came gently but firmly. If a man can discard a promise that easily, then he has already told us everything about his character. The room fell quiet again. Across the city, in a tall glass building overlooking the Hudson River, Alexander Hawthorne sat alone in his office long after most employees had gone home. The skyline glowed with evening lights beyond the windows, but his attention remained on a single thought that refused to leave his mind. He had attended hundreds of meetings, negotiated contracts worth millions of dollars, and faced rooms full of powerful investors without hesitation. Yet the image that returned again and again was not from any boardroom. It was the sight of Emily Carter walking down the aisle of an empty church, her head held high, while an entire room whispered about her misfortune. Alexander leaned back slowly in his chair and looked out across the darkening city. William had always believed wealth and status were the only things that mattered. But for the first time that day, Alexander wondered if his brother had just made the most expensive mistake of his life. The following morning, New York awakened beneath a pale gray sky, the kind that made the Hudson River look like brushed steel beneath the rising light. Inside the Carter home, the day began earlier than usual. Emily Carter stood at the small wooden desk in the corner of the dining room, sleeves rolled neatly to her elbows as she sorted through a stack of documents. Bills, letters, business records left behind after her father's passing. The quiet scratching of her pen across paper filled the room while the rest of the house still slept. Outside, the distant hum of morning traffic drifted through the open window, mingling with the smell of fresh coffee. Emily worked carefully, her mind focused on numbers instead of memories. A wedding that never happened could not pay rent, and dignity alone would not keep the Carter family secure. She had learned long ago that calm thinking solved problems faster than heartbreak ever could. Across the city, sunlight slowly climbed the glass walls of Hawthorne Financial Group. The building rose 30 floors above the busy avenue, a monument to decades of careful decisions and disciplined leadership. Inside the top office, Alexander Hawthorne stood near the wide window overlooking Manhattan. In his hand rested a folder he had not opened in several minutes. His thoughts had wandered again. He rarely allowed distraction during work hours. Numbers, contracts, strategy. Those were the things that usually occupied his mind. Yet the image of Emily Carter standing alone at the altar returned with quiet persistence. Not the humiliation, not the letter, but the remarkable calm in her eyes afterward. Most people would have broken beneath that kind of public embarrassment. Instead, she had walked away with her composure intact. Alexander exhaled slowly and set the folder down on his desk. His assistant knocked gently before stepping inside. "Good morning, sir. Your 10 o'clock meeting with the Chicago investors has been confirmed." Alexander nodded. "Thank you, Laura." She hesitated for a moment, curiosity briefly crossing her expression. "Sir, the news from yesterday is already circulating through the financial circles. Your brother's engagement announcement has attracted considerable attention." Alexander gave a faint nod. "I expected as much." Laura studied him carefully. There was something unusual in his calm tone. William Hawthorne had always drawn attention like a spotlight, yet today Alexander seemed less concerned with the engagement itself than with something else entirely. When she left the office, Alexander returned to the window and looked down at the city streets far below. People moved quickly along the sidewalks, taxis weaving through traffic, life unfolding with relentless energy. Somewhere within that vast city, Emily Carter was beginning a new day as well. Not as a bride, not as the future wife of a Hawthorne, simply as herself. And for reasons Alexander could not fully explain, that thought did not fade from his mind. Meanwhile, several miles away, Emily finished balancing the final column of numbers and leaned back slightly in her chair. The figures confirmed what she had suspected. The family finances were tight, but not hopeless. With careful planning and determination, they could recover. She closed the ledger and looked toward the window where the morning sun had begun to brighten the street. People would talk about the broken wedding for weeks, perhaps months. But Emily Carter had already decided something important. Her future would not be defined by the man who walked away. Somewhere across the city, Alexander Hawthorne unknowingly reached the same quiet conclusion. 3 days later, the story had already traveled farther than Emily Carter ever expected. In Manhattan cafes and quiet office hallways, people spoke in lowered voices about the abandoned wedding at St. Matthew's Church. Some expressed sympathy. Others repeated the details with thin smiles and raised eyebrows. In the world of polite society, scandal moved faster than truth. Yet inside the Carter house, the days continued with quiet determination. That afternoon, Emily sat at the dining table surrounded by papers once again. reviewing a list of potential clients for the small bookkeeping service she had begun offering months earlier. The Carter family had once lived comfortably, but after her father's passing, Emily had slowly learned how to rebuild stability, one careful decision at a time. Her mother stood nearby arranging flowers in a small glass vase, while Daniel leaned against the doorway, watching his sister with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. Most people would still be hiding from the world after what happened, Daniel said finally. Emily looked up from the papers and offered a calm smile. Hiding will not improve the numbers in this ledger. She tapped the open notebook gently. Besides, people will eventually grow bored with the story. They always do. Outside the window, a delivery driver stepped out of his truck, carrying a package toward the neighboring house. Life moved forward with remarkable indifference to embarrassment. Across the East River, inside the polished conference room of Hawthorne Financial Group, Alexander Hawthorne sat at the head of a long glass table as several investors discussed shipping contracts and international expansion. Charts filled the large screen behind them while the room buzzed with quiet calculation. Yet Alexander's attention drifted again, not toward the numbers, but toward a memory from the previous morning. Before leaving for work, he had stopped briefly at a small cafe near Bryant Park. It was a habit he rarely allowed himself during busy weeks, but that day something had drawn him there. As he stepped inside, he noticed a familiar figure seated near the window with a stack of documents spread across the table. Emily Carter. She had been speaking calmly with the cafe owner, explaining accounting records and pointing to several notes in a ledger. The conversation had lasted nearly 20 minutes. Alexander had not interrupted. Instead, he had quietly taken a seat across the room, observing the quiet confidence with which she handled each question. There had been no trace of bitterness in her voice. No sign that only days earlier she had stood at the center of a public humiliation. When the cafe owner finally shook her hand in agreement, Emily gathered her papers with the same composed grace Alexander remembered from the church steps. Now, seated once again in the conference room, Alexander listened to the investors discussing profit margins while a different realization formed in his mind. William had always believed Emily Carter was simply a convenient match. Respectable family, polite reputation, a future that looked pleasant on paper. But the woman Alexander had seen at the cafe was something entirely different. Intelligent, focused, resilient. The kind of person who rebuilt her life without waiting for someone else to rescue it. Across the long conference table, one of the investors paused mid-sentence. Mr. Hawthorne, do you agree with the revised shipping proposal? Alexander blinked once and returned his attention to the discussion, his voice steady as ever. Yes. But even as the meeting continued, one thought remained quietly at the back of his mind. For the second time that week, Alexander Hawthorne found himself wondering how his brother could have failed to see the remarkable strength standing right in front of him. The following week, the city had already begun to move on to newer headlines, but quiet consequences continued to ripple beneath the surface of New York society. In elegant restaurants along Fifth Avenue and inside polished office towers overlooking the Hudson River, conversations about the abandoned ceremony still surfaced whenever the Hawthorne name appeared. Some people spoke with curiosity, others with thinly hidden amusement. Yet in the Carter home, the attention mattered less with each passing day. Emily Carter had filled her schedule with work that demanded focus rather than reflection. That afternoon, she walked along a busy Brooklyn street carrying a leather folder tucked beneath her arm. The late autumn air crisp against her cheeks as taxis rolled past, and storefront windows reflected the steady movement of the city. She had just finished meeting with a small printing company that needed help reorganizing several months of financial records. The owner, a middle-aged man named Mr. Bennett, had listened carefully as Emily explained a plan to stabilize his accounts and reduce unnecessary expenses. By the time she stepped back onto the sidewalk, he had already scheduled another appointment for the following week. It was not a grand contract, but it was a beginning. Emily paused for a moment beside a street vendor selling hot coffee and allowed herself a quiet breath of satisfaction. Each small success meant another step toward independence. Meanwhile, across the river, the Hawthorne offices remained as busy as ever, though inside Alexander Hawthorne's mind a different kind of calculation had begun. That evening, he sat alone in his office reviewing reports under the warm glow of a desk lamp while the city lights shimmered beyond the tall windows. The numbers on the page demanded his attention, yet another memory returned uninvited. The calm way Emily Carter had discussed financial strategies with the cafe owner. The steady confidence in her voice. He had spent years evaluating people in business negotiations, studying small details that revealed strength or hesitation. What he saw in Emily had not been performance. It had been genuine ability. Alexander closed the report slowly and leaned back in his chair. For most of his life, he had watched his younger brother pursue attention and admiration with relentless energy. William enjoyed the spotlight, the parties, the headlines announcing each new venture or relationship. Yet in the quiet moments after those announcements faded, Alexander often found himself managing the consequences left behind. Now another announcement had taken its place in society columns. William Hawthorne engaged to Margaret Whitmore, the daughter of one of the wealthiest families on the East Coast. From a business perspective, the match made perfect sense. Yet as Alexander looked out across the darkened skyline, he felt an unexpected sense of distance from the celebration surrounding it. Somewhere in the city, Emily Carter was continuing her day without hesitation, rebuilding her future with patience and determination. She did not appear in newspapers beside glamorous engagement photos. She did not chase attention. And perhaps that was exactly why Alexander Hawthorne found his thoughts returning to her again and again. Not out of pity, not out of curiosity, but because the quiet strength he had witnessed felt increasingly rare in a world that often confused wealth with character. And though he had not yet realized it fully, the distance between their two lives was already beginning to narrow. 2 weeks passed, and with them the sharp edge of the scandal slowly dulled in the public mind. New York was a city that rarely paused long enough to remember yesterday's drama when tomorrow promised another. Yet beneath the steady rhythm of traffic and crowded sidewalks, certain stories continued to move quietly through the right circles. On a clear Friday afternoon, Emily Carter stepped into the public library near Bryant Park, carrying her familiar leather folder and a notebook filled with neat columns of figures. The tall windows allowed pale sunlight to spill across the long reading tables where students and professionals worked in quiet concentration. Emily chose a seat near the back of the room and opened her ledger, carefully reviewing the financial statements of 2 small businesses she had recently agreed to assist. The work required patience and attention to detail, and Emily welcomed both. Numbers did not whisper behind her back. Numbers did not judge her past. They simply told the truth if someone was willing to read them carefully. Nearly 40 minutes passed before she noticed someone pause near her table. At first she assumed it was another visitor searching for a seat, but when the chair across from her moved slightly, she looked up. Alexander Hawthorne stood there, one hand resting lightly on the back of the chair, as though he had been deciding for several seconds whether to speak. For a brief moment, surprise crossed Emily's expression before she closed her notebook. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said politely, "I did not expect to see you here." Alexander offered a small nod of greeting. "I could say the same." The quiet library air softened his normally firm voice. "I come here occasionally when I need a place that discourages interruptions." Emily allowed herself a faint smile. "That explains why everyone is whispering." Alexander sat down across from her, though he remained careful not to disturb the neat arrangement of papers spread across the table. "I hope I am not interrupting important work." "You are interrupting accounting," Emily replied gently. "But accounting is patient. It will wait." Alexander glanced briefly at the organized columns in her notebook. Balance sheets, expense projections, handwritten calculations. "You have been busy." Emily followed his gaze. People still need help organizing their businesses, even when society believes a woman should hide after embarrassment. Her tone remained calm, but the quiet honesty behind it caught Alexander's attention. "I have noticed that you do not hide very easily," he said. Emily closed the folder slowly and rested her hands on the table. "I learned something important from my father when I was younger. When circumstances change, the only useful response is to continue moving forward." Alexander studied her for a moment, the steady confidence in her words confirming what he had suspected since the morning at the church. William had walked away from a situation he barely understood. "I believe you will move forward very successfully," he replied. For the first time since they had met, Emily seemed slightly unsure how to respond. Not uncomfortable, simply thoughtful. Outside the tall windows, the late afternoon sun slipped lower over Bryant Park, while people crossed the lawn and taxis moved steadily through the surrounding streets. Life in New York continued without pause. Yet inside the quiet library something subtle had changed. What had begun as a brief encounter between strangers now carried the quiet possibility of something more meaningful. Neither of them said it aloud, but both of them understood that this conversation would not be their last. The late afternoon sun drifted lower over Bryant Park as the quiet conversation in the library slowly came to an end. Emily Carter gathered her neatly arranged papers while Alexander Hawthorne rose from the chair across the table, both of them aware that the brief meeting had lasted far longer than either of them originally intended. Outside the tall windows, the city moved with its usual restless energy, people crossing the sidewalks with hurried steps while the distant sound of taxis and buses carried through the open streets. Emily placed her notebook carefully inside her leather folder and stood. I should return home before my mother begins to wonder whether I have decided to move into the library permanently, she said with a soft trace of humor. Alexander allowed a faint smile to appear. I suspect the librarians would admire your work ethic, but they might object to the stacks of accounting ledgers. They walked together toward the front doors where the warm air of the building gave way to the crisp autumn breeze waiting outside. For a moment they paused on the wide stone steps overlooking the park. The trees had begun to shift into shades of amber and gold, their leaves rustling quietly as people strolled along the paths. Emily looked out across the lawn and inhaled slowly. New York in the fall always feels like a beginning, she said thoughtfully. Alexander followed her gaze. Many people think of it as the end of summer. Emily shook her head gently. I prefer to think of it as the start of something new. Her words lingered between them for a moment before Alexander spoke again. If that is the case, then I hope this season brings you many successful beginnings. Emily met his eyes briefly, her expression calm but sincere. Thank you, Mr. Hawthorne. They exchanged a final nod before Emily turned toward the street and began walking along the edge of the park, her figure gradually blending into the movement of the crowd. Alexander remained on the steps for several seconds longer than necessary, watching until she disappeared beyond the corner. Across the city, however, a very different conversation was unfolding inside a luxurious penthouse overlooking the river. William Hawthorne stood near the tall windows with a glass in his hand, while Margaret Whitmore examined a collection of engagement announcements spread across a marble table. Society columns had begun printing the news of their upcoming wedding with considerable enthusiasm. Margaret smiled as she read aloud one of the headlines praising their union as a powerful alliance between two influential families. William listened with only partial attention. His gaze drifted across the skyline as the fading sunlight reflected off the river below. For reasons he could not clearly explain, a memory from several weeks earlier had returned unexpectedly. The sight of Emily Carter standing at the altar, the quiet strength in her posture even after reading the letter he had sent. Margaret looked up and noticed his distant expression. Is something troubling you, William? He turned back toward her quickly. Nothing important. Just business matters. She seemed satisfied with the explanation and returned to arranging the announcements. Yet as William glanced once more toward the city beyond the windows, a faint uneasiness lingered in his thoughts. Somewhere within that vast city the woman he had once intended to marry was continuing her life without him. And though he would not have admitted it aloud, the realization carried a quiet weight he had not expected. Several days later, the first true test of Emily Carter's resolve arrived in a place she once would have avoided entirely. The Grand Astoria ballroom stood glowing beneath thousands of warm lights as car after car pulled up to the long entrance staircase. The annual Manhattan Business Charity Gala had always been one of the most visible social gatherings of the season, attended by executives, investors, philanthropists, and the families whose names appeared regularly in financial headlines. Inside the vast ballroom, a live orchestra played softly while waiters moved between elegantly dressed guests carrying silver trays of sparkling drinks. Conversations blended into a steady hum of polite laughter and quiet negotiation. Emily paused just inside the entrance after handing her coat to the attendant, taking a moment to steady herself as she surveyed the crowded room. Months earlier, she had nearly declined the invitation, assuming the evening would bring only whispers and curious glances. But something within her had shifted since that morning at the church. Running away from society would only allow others to define her story. So instead, she stepped forward with calm determination, the soft blue dress she wore reflecting the warm glow of the chandeliers above. As she walked across the polished floor, a few heads turned, recognition passing quietly between several guests. The rumors had not entirely disappeared, yet something unexpected followed those looks. Respect. The quiet confidence with which Emily carried herself left little room for pity. Across the ballroom, Alexander Hawthorne stood near a group of investors discussing international shipping contracts when he noticed the subtle shift in attention spreading through the room. He followed the direction of several glances and immediately saw the reason. Emily Carter had entered the gala. For a moment, he forgot the conversation entirely. The orchestra's music seemed to soften as he watched her greet the event host with a polite smile before moving further into the crowd. She did not look like someone hiding from embarrassment. She looked like someone who had already moved beyond it. One of the investors beside Alexander noticed his distraction and turned as well. "Interesting evening," the man remarked casually. "I did not expect to see Miss Carter here tonight after everything that happened." Alexander's expression remained calm. "I believe Miss Carter has already demonstrated that she is not easily discouraged." Across the room, Emily accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and began speaking with a small group of business owners she had recently worked with. The conversation quickly shifted toward practical matters of finance and growth, and within minutes the earlier whispers faded beneath genuine professional interest. Yet not everyone in the ballroom remained comfortable with the scene unfolding. Near the far side of the room, another arrival had just stepped through the entrance doors. William Hawthorne and Margaret Whitmore moved through the crowd together, their appearance drawing immediate attention from photographers covering the event. Margaret's elegant silver gown caught the light as she greeted acquaintances with practiced charm. William smiled for the cameras, but the moment his eyes swept across the ballroom, they froze on a familiar figure standing near the center of the floor. Emily Carter. She stood there speaking confidently among respected professionals, her calm presence commanding far more quiet admiration than he had expected. For the first time since the engagement announcement, a strange and uncomfortable realization formed in William's mind. The woman he had once dismissed as ordinary was standing in the same room, admired by the very society he believed would forget her. And across the ballroom, Alexander Hawthorne was already walking toward her. The orchestra's music shifted into a slower melody as Alexander Hawthorne crossed the ballroom floor with calm determination, his attention fixed on the woman standing near the center of the gathering. Around him conversations continued, but several guests subtly turned their heads, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Emily Carter had just finished explaining a financial strategy to a small group of business owners when she noticed Alexander approaching. For a brief moment her expression showed mild surprise, though it quickly settled back into the composed calm that had become her quiet strength. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said politely as he reached her side, "I did not realize this event was on your calendar tonight." Alexander inclined his head slightly. "I rarely miss the charity gala. It supports several community programs our company funds each year." He paused before adding in a softer tone, "I am pleased to see that you decided to attend as well." Emily lifted her glass of sparkling water with a thoughtful smile. "I decided that avoiding crowded rooms would not improve my reputation or my business opportunities." Alexander allowed a faint hint of admiration to show in his expression. "That sounds like a very practical conclusion." Across the ballroom, William Hawthorne watched the interaction unfold with growing tension he could not easily explain. Margaret Whitmore stood beside him greeting a group of donors, but William's attention remained fixed on the quiet conversation taking place near the center of the room. The sight unsettled him more than he expected. Alexander had always maintained a careful distance from personal scandals, preferring to focus on business matters rather than society gossip. Yet now he stood speaking with Emily Carter as though their conversation mattered more than the dozens of influential guests surrounding them. Margaret noticed William's distraction and followed his gaze. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she recognized the pair. "That is your former fiancé," she said calmly. William shifted his posture. "Yes. It appears she has decided to attend after all." Margaret studied the scene with cool curiosity. "She seems quite comfortable for someone who was publicly abandoned only a few weeks ago." William did not respond immediately. Instead, he watched as Alexander offered Emily his arm with quiet courtesy. "May I have the honor of the next dance, Miss Carter?" Alexander asked. The orchestra had begun a graceful waltz that floated gently across the ballroom. Emily hesitated only for a second before placing her hand lightly on his arm. "I suppose one dance will not disrupt my accounting schedule too severely," she replied with a small smile. Together they stepped onto the polished dance floor as several nearby conversations paused entirely. The moment carried a subtle weight that many guests instantly understood. When the music began, Alexander guided Emily into the rhythm of the waltz with steady confidence, his movements precise yet relaxed. Emily followed naturally, her calm presence matching his pace as the two of them moved across the floor beneath the glowing chandeliers. From across the room, William felt a sudden tightening in his chest. The quiet admiration appearing on the faces of nearby guests was unmistakable. People were no longer whispering about Emily Carter as the woman who had been abandoned. They were watching her as the woman dancing gracefully with Alexander Hawthorne. And for the first time since sending that letter, William realized something he had not expected to feel at all: regret. The music carried them across the polished floor beneath the golden chandeliers, each measured step of the waltz unfolding with quiet elegance, while the crowd watched with growing fascination. Emily Carter moved with calm grace, her light blue dress catching the soft glow of the ballroom lights as Alexander Hawthorne guided the dance with steady confidence. Neither of them spoke for the first few moments. The orchestra's melody seemed to fill the space between them, creating a calm rhythm that allowed the rest of the crowded room to fade into the background. Finally, Alexander spoke in a low voice that only she could hear. "I hope you realize that half the room is watching us." Emily allowed the faintest smile to appear. "Only half. I was expecting the entire room." Alexander's expression softened slightly. "You appear remarkably calm about it." Emily met his gaze briefly before looking past his shoulder toward the edge of the ballroom. "When people expect you to collapse, the most effective response is to remain standing." Alexander nodded slowly, clearly recognizing the quiet strength behind her words. "I believe you have mastered that skill very well." The orchestra carried the dancers through another graceful turn, while nearby guests paused their conversations entirely, drawn by the understated significance of the moment. Across the room, William Hawthorne remained near the edge of the crowd with Margaret Whitmore at his side, though his attention had not left the dance floor for several minutes. Margaret followed his gaze again, noticing the intensity with which he observed his brother and Emily. "It is only a dance," she said calmly, though a hint of curiosity colored her tone. William exhaled quietly. "Yes, of course." Yet the simple scene unfolding before him felt far more complicated than he cared to admit. When the music began to fade, the dancers slowed their steps until the final note lingered in the air. Polite applause moved through the room as couples separated and guests returned to their conversations. Alexander guided Emily toward the quieter side of the ballroom, where tall glass doors opened onto a terrace overlooking the city lights. The cool evening air greeted them as they stepped outside, the distant skyline glowing softly against the dark sky. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of music and laughter drifted faintly through the open doors behind them, while the quiet terrace offered a brief escape from the attention of the crowd. Emily rested her hands lightly on the railing and looked out toward the river where reflections shimmered across the water. "Thank you for the dance," she said gently. "I suspect you have made this evening far more interesting than the newspapers expected." Alexander stood beside her, his posture relaxed but thoughtful. "I did not ask you to dance for the sake of the newspapers." Emily turned slightly toward him. "Then why did you ask?" Alexander considered the question for a moment before answering with quiet honesty. "Because every time I see you, Miss Carter, I discover that you are far more remarkable than my brother ever understood." The words were spoken calmly, yet their sincerity hung in the cool evening air. Emily looked at him in surprise, clearly unprepared for such direct praise. Alexander continued after a brief pause. "William believed he was choosing wealth and advantage when he changed his plans. But I believe he walked away from something far more valuable." For the first time that evening, Emily seemed uncertain how to respond. She looked back toward the glowing ballroom behind them where the music had begun again and guests moved across the dance floor in elegant patterns. Somewhere inside that room, William Hawthorne was still watching. And for the first time in many weeks, Emily Carter realized that the story everyone thought they understood had only just begun to change. The cool night air on the terrace seemed to quiet the entire world for a moment as Emily Carter considered the words Alexander Hawthorne had just spoken. The distant glow of the city stretched across the river like scattered stars, and the soft music from the ballroom drifted faintly through the open doors behind them. Emily rested her hands lightly against the railing, her thoughts moving carefully through the unexpected sincerity in his voice. People rarely spoke so plainly in rooms filled with wealth and influence. Most conversations in that world were polished, strategic, designed to protect reputations and alliances. Yet Alexander had spoken without hesitation. "You give me far too much credit," she said gently after a moment. "I am simply trying to build a stable future for my family." Alexander shook his head slightly. "That is precisely what I admire." He looked out across the skyline before continuing. "Most people in this city spend their energy maintaining appearances. You have chosen something more difficult. You have chosen resilience." The quiet certainty in his tone carried more weight than flattery ever could. Emily felt the words settle somewhere deeper than she expected. For several seconds neither of them spoke again. Inside the ballroom, another round of applause rose briefly as the orchestra finished a lively number, followed by the hum of conversation as guests moved between tables. Then the terrace doors opened again. William Hawthorne stepped outside. His presence shifted the air immediately. The confident charm he usually carried in public settings had been replaced by a more controlled expression, one that suggested careful restraint. Margaret Whitmore remained inside speaking with a group of donors, but William's attention was focused entirely on the two people standing near the railing. Alexander turned slightly when he heard the door open, his posture calm, as always. William approached slowly, his polished shoes crossing the stone terrace with measured steps. "I thought I might find the two of you out here," William said, his voice even but carrying an unmistakable edge. Emily straightened slightly, though her composure did not falter. "Good evening, William." William studied her for a moment, perhaps expecting some sign of lingering embarrassment or resentment. Instead, he found the same calm strength that had unsettled him earlier that night. "I must admit," he continued carefully, "I did not expect you to attend this event after everything that happened." Emily met his gaze without hesitation. Life does not pause simply because one chapter closes unexpectedly. William gave a short breath that might have been a quiet laugh. "You always had a talent for turning situations into lessons." Alexander spoke before the conversation could drift further. "William, if you came to discuss business matters, this is not the place." William looked from his brother to Emily again, something complicated passing briefly through his expression. "I did not come to discuss business. I came to say that perhaps things happened too quickly that morning." Emily understood the meaning behind his careful phrasing immediately. A quiet offer to reconsider. Yet instead of reacting emotionally, she simply folded her hands together and spoke with calm clarity. "Some decisions reveal their truth the moment they are made. And yours did exactly that." The silence that followed was deeper than the music inside the ballroom. William held her gaze for several seconds before finally looking away toward the city lights. For the first time that evening, he seemed to recognize what everyone else in the room had begun to see. Emily Carter was no longer standing in the shadow of the choice he had made. She had already stepped beyond it. The silence on the terrace lingered for several seconds after Emily Carter's calm words settled into the night air. William Hawthorne stood near the stone railing, the distant lights of Manhattan reflecting faintly in his eyes as he slowly understood that the quiet confidence standing before him could no longer be influenced by regret or second thoughts. For the first time since the engagement announcement, the certainty he had always carried felt less secure. Inside the ballroom, laughter and music continued, the elegant world of polished conversations moving forward as though nothing important had happened. Yet on the terrace, the truth of the evening had already become clear. Emily had not come to reclaim the past. She had come to prove that she no longer needed it. William exhaled quietly and straightened his jacket. "It appears you have made your position very clear," he said at last, his voice controlled but noticeably subdued. Emily inclined her head slightly. "I believe you made the position clear first." Alexander Hawthorne remained beside her, his expression calm, yet unmistakably protective. William glanced briefly toward his brother, recognizing the steady presence that had not moved since the conversation began. There had always been an unspoken rivalry between them, though neither of them had openly acknowledged it in years. Tonight, that quiet tension felt sharper than ever. William gave a short nod. Then I wish you both a pleasant evening. Without another word, he turned and walked back toward the ballroom doors, leaving the terrace behind him. When the doors closed again, the cool night air returned to its earlier calm. Emily watched the lights of the city for a moment longer before letting out a quiet breath she had not realized she was holding. That conversation was inevitable, she said softly. Alexander studied her for a moment before replying. You handled it with remarkable clarity. Emily looked toward him, the faint glow of the skyline reflected in her eyes. I learned something important over the past few weeks. Some endings are not tragedies. They are simply corrections. Alexander allowed a thoughtful smile to appear. That is a perspective most people take years to discover. They remained on the terrace for a moment longer before returning inside. As they stepped back into the ballroom, the atmosphere felt subtly different. Conversations paused briefly as several guests noticed their return together, the earlier whispers now replaced with quiet curiosity and growing respect. The orchestra began another elegant melody while couples moved across the polished floor once more. Emily glanced toward the crowd, and then back at Alexander. I suspect tomorrow's newspapers will have a new story to discuss, she said lightly. Alexander extended his arm with quiet confidence. Then perhaps we should give them something worthwhile to write about. Emily hesitated for only a moment before placing her hand gently on his arm. Together they stepped back onto the dance floor, the music rising softly around them as the evening continued. Across the room, several guests watched with thoughtful interest, already sensing that the narrative they had once whispered about was changing shape. And somewhere beyond the tall windows of the ballroom, the city lights shimmered over the river, reflecting a simple truth that sometimes took a broken promise to reveal. The person who walks away does not always lose the least. Sometimes the greatest loss belongs to the one who failed to recognize what stood before him.